everybody. Hi, welcome. Hi. My name is Christy Harpst, and I am the program manager for the historic districts here at the City of Charlotte. Before we jump in, we have we're calling it a sizzle reel video that we'd like to share with you about overlays.
Beautiful.
Yes? Okay.
Yep.
There you go. Okay. Trying again.
Your cul-de-sac culture.
Or street, striking. The unique charm of each neighborhood is what makes Charlotte, well, Charlotte. As the Queen City continues to grow, develop, and change, city leadership knows most things look the best when they keep their original charm. Preserving the neighborhood character of our diverse communities within the City of Charlotte is a key element of the Unified Development Ordinance, or as you've gotten to know it, the UDO. So you may be asking, how? City employees have developed a comprehensive tool that empowers residents to help shape the changes they see in and around their community. Through an overlay district, residents can create special requirements in addition to the rules of the existing zoning district. Although some overlay districts can change land uses, the overlay districts discussed here do not. Residents can submit an overlay application to preserve historic street or area districts, neighborhood character districts, or residential infill districts. Adopted overlays will apply special requirements to future planning aspects like parcels, setbacks, zoning, rezoning, development, and infill development. To learn more about the overlay districts tool, which overlay you should use, the process of how they're adopted, and to submit an overlay application, visit cltgov.me/overlay or email overlays@charlottesc.gov.
We look forward to working together as we all shape Charlotte's future.
Great. All right.
It's what makes
Oh, trying to move forward. So we have a slight change to our agenda tonight. Allison Craig sends her regrets. She can't be with us tonight. She's our planning director. If you came to our event on August 3rd, you would have met Allison. She gave our introduction. So in her stead, I'm giving the welcome. Again, my name is Christy Harpst, and I am the Historic District Program Manager. And then we have another short overlays video that gets a little more in depth about what overlays are. So just by a show of hands, who came to the August 3rd introduction meeting? Is anyone there? Okay. We got a couple of people. So all of that information, the presentations online, we'll share links at the end. But we did, since we figured we'd have some new faces here, we wanted to give a brief overview about what the overlays are before we get into our moderated panel discussion. And before the panel presentation, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and tell just a little bit about overlays and why we're doing this. As you heard in the video, residential overlay districts are part of the Unified Development Ordinance, and the UDO revised development regulations for general zoning districts, and it does a lot, but it doesn't do everything. So the bigger picture is neighborhoods were asking for tools to help guide the growth and development in their communities that did more than just the regular zoning. And so in looking to our partners across the state and other best practices from cities across the United States, we came up with 3 new overlay districts: a neighborhood character overlay, a residential infill overlay, and a new historic district overlay street side, which is just the first 50% of the lot. And something everyone should know is that these tools, they are elective. They're not automatically applied to anyone's property. And it is a grassroots effort from neighborhood residents and leaders. So these are not overlays that the city will come in and say you need in your neighborhood. It is all something that the neighborhoods decide together that this is a tool to help them guide the future growth and development in their community. The other thing about these overlays, before we really get into it, these are residential overlays. So neighborhood character overlay, residential infill overlay, they are for residential areas only, not It doesn't include big multifamily. It doesn't include commercial, industrial. It's just single family, duplex, and triplex. The one exception to that is the historic districts, and the historic districts can be applied to commercial areas. The other key with these overlays is that the elements in your neighborhood, the character and what makes your neighborhood unique and special, those elements have to already exist in your neighborhood. These overlays are not used to create desired features or new development patterns. It's to maintain what's existing in your neighborhood now. So with that, I want to switch to the overlays video. And so you'll be hearing from me again, but in video form. So.
Did you know the city of Charlotte has tools in its unified development ordinance to help preserve the character of your neighborhood or help shape the rapid changes we're seeing as Charlotte grows? These tools are called overlay zoning districts, and we are going to talk about what they are and how they work. But before we get started, there are some fun new terms that you should know. First is a piece of land with specific legal boundaries, also often called a lot. If you own a house, this is the land your house sits on. Each one has a unique parcel identification number, called a PIN, and is searchable on the Mecklenburg County Polaris 3G map and website. Setback. How far a building sits from the property lines on all sides, front, left, right, and rear. Zoning. A set of rules for an area that determines regulations for the uses allowed, placement, spacing, and the size of land and buildings. Rezoning. The process to change the zoning of a parcel or a group of parcels to allow different regulations. Development or infill development. Constructing a new building on an empty lot or a lot where a building has been demolished. Now, let's talk a little more about overlay districts in general and how they work. Overlay districts are special zoning districts that create requirements in addition to the rules of the existing zoning district. Although some overlay districts can change land uses, the overlay districts being discussed here do not. A couple of other things to know. None of these overlays can prevent demolition of homes in your neighborhood, nor do they replace the zoning regulations or change uses allowed on the land. Property owners are not required to update or change their properties. The neighborhood character and the residential infill overlays only apply to residential areas, including single-family, duplex, and triplex buildings. They cannot be applied to larger apartment complexes or commercial developments. And lastly, only one overlay can be used at a time. They cannot be combined. All overlays are created through the rezoning process and are formally adopted via city council vote. The process for putting each in place is different and requires varying levels of community approval and participation. In Charlotte, there are 4 different overlay options: the neighborhood character overlay, the residential infill overlay, and 2 historic district overlays. Let's talk about the neighborhood character overlay for a better understanding of how and why it can be used. Maybe it will be a right fit for your neighborhood. First, the neighborhood character overlay, or NCO, is for areas that were developed at least 25 years ago that have a consistent development pattern and key design features. The streets, lots, and buildings should share common features such as how close the buildings are to the street, how tall the houses are, how close the buildings are to each other, where people park their vehicles, if there are sheds and garages in the backyards, and the presence of large trees. It also requires a minimum of 15 contiguous acres with 75% of the lots developed. How does it work? With the help of city staff, your neighborhood chooses from a menu of elements that include building coverage and height, setbacks, lot width, surface parking size and location, and tree standards. You can choose all, one, or any combination of elements that ensure they are matched for renovations, additions, and new construction. For example, a neighborhood of cottage-style homes may have an average front yard setback of 36 feet and an average building height of 25 feet. In neighborhood 1 zoning districts, which apply to most neighborhoods in Charlotte, front setbacks range from 17 feet to 27 feet, and buildings can be up to 48 feet tall. A neighborhood character overlay, or NCO, could establish custom setback and height requirements for new construction to match the existing character of the cottage-style homes. You may want to consider this for your neighborhood when you want to encourage development that is consistent with its existing character, manage rapid growth and change, or create a transition between locally designated historic districts and other residential areas. Let's talk about the residential infill overlay for a better understanding of how and why it can be used. Maybe it will be right for your neighborhood. The residential infill overlay, or RIO, is similar to the neighborhood character overlay because its intent is to maintain existing neighborhood conditions when new infill development occurs. How does it work? It's a lot simpler and quicker to create and only controls front setback, building sidewall height, and building size, or total square footage. There is no menu of elements to choose from. So if an RIO is put in place, it controls all three. The setback and size allowed for new infill construction is based on the average of existing closest buildings on the same side of the street. The building sidewall height allowed for new construction is limited to 20 feet for the average of the building sidewalls on both sides of the lot, whichever is greater. It requires a minimum of 50 contiguous lots. A residential infill overlay, or RIO, won't help preserve the character of your neighborhood, but it could curb rapid change and growth. Let's talk about the two historic district overlays for a better understanding of how and why they can be used. Maybe one of these will be right for your neighborhood. The historic district overlay, or HDO, and the street side historic district overlay, HDOS, give a neighborhood the most control over new development and redevelopment. The overlay requires a design review process for all exterior changes to structures and lots, including demolition, additions, and new construction. An HDO and HDOS neighborhood must have historic, cultural, architectural, or social significance. How does it work? Residents in an HDO must submit an application and gain approval from the Historic District Commission before making any changes to a property or outside of a building. The Historic District Commission and the city staff work closely with applicants to make sure changes to the property meet a set of design standards. The design standards are based on the federal historic preservation standards and are tailored specifically to Charlotte. The standards explain how building owners can respect historic features like front porches as they make changes or repairs to historic buildings or design a new building. The HDOS is similar to an HDO, but mostly focuses on the first half of the building and lots from the street. Approval is not typically required for projects located in rear yards or rear additions. They are required, however, for any additions that are taller or wider than the existing structure. To see if these overlays can apply to your neighborhood, visit the charlotteudo.org website, where you will find additional resources that go into further detail. And, of course, contact information for city staff to help you every step of the way.
Okay. So next, we're going to transition into the more interactive portion of the evening, and we're so excited to welcome our colleagues from the city of Raleigh and the town of Chapel Hill. Both of these communities have had overlay districts in place for many years, and we're looking forward to hearing about their experiences with overlay districts and how they've impacted their communities. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Monica Carney Holmes. She is going to be our moderator this evening. Monica is the director of the Design and Preservation Division here at the City of Charlotte. Monica, thank you. And Monica will also be introducing our speakers.
Yes.
Off to you.
So we are going to dive right in. So thanks for being here this evening. We're really excited to do this both in person and also be able to record it so we can have it for years to come and go back to it. So let me introduce our speakers first. We have Bynum Walter, so right over here to the right or to your left. I know, no, it's fine, you're good. And Bynum is Assistant Director for Planning and Development in the City of Raleigh, with responsibility for the city's long-range and preservation planning programs, in addition to ongoing work to manage the city's rezoning process and comprehensive plan. Her current projects include station area planning for the city's western and southern bus rapid transit corridors. Prior to joining the city of Raleigh, she worked for Air Gross as a project manager and campus planner for college and university campus master plans. A Raleigh native, she holds a Bachelor of Arts degree and a Master of Regional Planning from UNC Chapel Hill. So welcome. We're very excited to have you here. And then sitting next to her is Corey Lyles. Corey Lyles serves as a development review manager for the town of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. As part of their wonderful stellar planning team, his work involves applying the town's regulations and long-range goals to proposals for new development and seeking the best development outcomes for the community. Corey joined Chapel Hill Planning in 2016, following prior work as a planner for the Research Triangle Foundation of North Carolina. And he also received his Master's of Regional Planning from UNC Chapel Hill, so seeing a common theme here in the great state of North Carolina. In his free time, Corey enjoys weekend road trips, a cappella music, and keeping up with a 2-year-old, which we all know is a large endeavor. So welcome. So I am going to just quickly, before we just dive into questions, I thought it might be worthwhile if each of you wants to spend just 90 seconds to a couple minutes just giving a little bit of overview of your cities and situation, and then we'll dive right into the questions. So some of that might be a little bit of duplicate, but I think it would be good just to hear that piece to start off. So Bynum, do you want to get us started?
So I grew up in Raleigh. My office is a block. Can you hear me?
Oh, you have to turn on the mic for the recording.
For the
I
people.
should have. Okay. Yes, there you go.
Super.
Yeah.
I grew up in Raleigh. My office is a block away from my third great grandfather's saloon. I joke that I haven't gotten very far. He came to Raleigh after the Civil War to help build the post office the federal post office on Fable Street. And he's one of my more newly arrived to North Carolina relatives. His children married into North Carolina families that had been here longer. So I know Raleigh well. I thought I knew Raleigh really well when I started work for the city in 2013, because riding around Raleigh with my parents, I had heard a lot of stories. You know, and like even as recently as like 2019, I drove down a street with my mother. I had never driven down with her before. And she goes, "Oh yeah, your great great grandfather was born in that house." So I have a particular lens and lived experience. That's a way that I know Raleigh. And then when I came to work in the city of Raleigh, I learned where the women's prison was. I started riding the bus, which I had never done as a young person growing up in Raleigh. And I went on a walking tour, actually, as part of a state planning conference with a woman named Lynette Williams. And walking around Raleigh with her was just like being with my parents. And the most famous people from our social circles overlapped. And the details of everything else were totally different, totally different. And I realized how subjective my parents' version of Raleigh life and history and development was, and how little I really knew about the place I had lived most of my life. So that's part of my lens on Raleigh. And I would imagine that a lot of people who have grown up in Charlotte would have a very similar experience to mine, because we have not historically in North Carolina done a great job of talking about segregation, about civil rights, about the inequity of the development patterns in our communities, right? The other thing I will say is that I recently said, again, this is about my mother. I recently said to her, you know, Raleigh now is more than twice the size it was when I finished high school. the older I get, the less impressive that is. But her response, just like no beat skipped. Yeah, and it was already too big. And my right back to her was, and if it had been any smaller, I wouldn't still be here. Right? And so I think that is the tension of, I really like it the way it is, but in a capitalist America, status quo is bad, right? We consider that decline. And so the growth that makes our communities attractive to new people, to new money, to new jobs, to new services, to new kinds of ice cream, donuts, beer, whatever. That same draw creates change that makes all of us really uncomfortable, right? And Raleigh's been changing like that at about the same rate since about 1945. So, you know, we have generations of people who are inherently uncomfortable. And just say that I was talking with some of you all before this about change, and this is happening near my neighborhood, and so much emotion in that. But I would just offer that context. Charlotte is not that different than Raleigh in terms of, actually, you guys grew faster than we did sooner. Raleigh is always behind the curve in that way. But just would offer that lens about growth in Raleigh, and I think that's very relevant to growth in Charlotte.
Okay, wow, I don't know how to follow that. Yes, I did. My name is Corey. Again, I work for Chapel Hill. I also grew up in Raleigh, and have been in the Triangle throughout my life. And Chapel Hill is where I went to school. So I came back to work there. And in a similar way, you know, you feel like you know it because you know campus and you know what's immediately around campus. And Chapel Hill is a small community, 60,000, a little bit more than that now, 60,000 people. So there's more to it than campus. It's not a full-fledged city, but there are these parts of it that can really feel like they're outside of the orbit of the university campus, which is central in the town geographically. So there is that same thread of just kind of discovering more to Chapel Hill and seeing the parts that have that separate identity. And it's something for people who live in Chapel Hill. It's kind of cross-examining, like, are we more than a college town? You know, what else can we do in terms of bringing in jobs and entrepreneurship, and having more going on? But Chapel Hill has also been actually a pretty slow-growing area. Especially compared to Raleigh and Charlotte and other parts of the Triangle. We set up something with the county in the 1980s called the rural buffer, which is just like, this is as far out as the town's going to grow. And we're not going to annex past that, and it'll stay county and it'll stay large lots, you know, more rural and agricultural. And so it then like called to question at some point in the past few decades of like, well, if people still want to move here and we're not growing out, are we growing up? Are we filling in? And so more recently, there's been sort of acceptance of how to bring in more growth to Chapel Hill. As planners, I think like we try to be we try to help people understand what can be beneficial about change, recognizing that change is hard, that change can be bad, it can be good. We're trying to get good outcomes from it. So, you know, Chapel Hill is changing. We want growth to be along certain major corridors and outside of some of the more established neighborhoods. But I think, like, again, just getting to know, for anyone who's, you know, getting to know more than Chapel Hill and thinks of it only as a college town, it is interesting to discover what else is going on. Not everyone who lives there works for or goes to school at UNC. I was, you know, really kind of struck when I learned about how big of like a refugee population we have, people who speak other languages, and that does relate to the university some. It's some of the low-level employees, or sorry, the employees who are working those jobs at university and finding opportunities to live in Chapel Hill. But you know, as the town has grown at its pace, filled in where it can, you know, there's a lot of different communities more diverse communities, and I think people would expect for Chapel Hill. So we try and understand all of that as we're thinking about the tools for planning in the town.
Great. Well, we are going to dive in. So I want to preface this. Thank you both for your introductions. I want to preface this a little bit with a lot of our questions in the moderated part are going to focus on the neighborhood character overlay. That is because it's a new tool in the city of Charlotte. If you have questions on residential infill overlay, or historic district street side, we'll be happy to include those in the audience Q&A and do the best we can. But we invited Raleigh and Chapel Hill here because most specifically, that has been the new tool that we've heard a lot about, and they have experience in working within it. So let's get started. So how long has your community had an ordinance for overlays, more specifically neighborhood character overlays, and how many do you have in place?
I'll go ahead. All right. So what we have in Chapel Hill, it's the same thing, but I'll be calling it NCDs, which is Neighborhood Conservation Districts. And our UDO that you heard about in the video, our version of that is called the LUMO. So
everybody likes an acronym.
Yeah.
It's like you gotta like an acronym. Yeah.
Yeah. So the LUMO, the Ordinance for Development, was adopted in 2003, and that's when we first brought in the tool for neighborhood conservation districts at Chapel Hill. So it's actually been around 20 years. That was interesting to note. And we have 10 neighborhoods in town that have adopted NCDs. And the first one came about a year after the LUMO was around, the tool came available. So, it got some quick uptake and actually a pretty good pace of them in those first 10 years. And then the last one we put in place was in 2017. So I think some combination of okay, the neighborhoods that really need them have them, and are there other tools that can better serve other neighborhoods? We've not seen the push for them more recently, but we do still, have them on the books and are administering them when there are proposals for development in those neighborhoods.
So Raleigh has had, we call it an NCOD. Apparently planners can't agree about acronyms. We've had neighborhood conservation overlays since 1990. And we have 21. The most recent one was applied in 2019. I would say the pattern of creation in our community really follows waves of development. So the first one in 1990 actually is in my grandparents' neighborhood. So I know that part of the city really well. That was mostly acre and 2-acre lots. And so there was and zoned to allow much more unit per acre than what was really actually developed there. And I think that is something that is often kind of sparks an interest in neighborhood conservation districts in our community, is that what's built and what's allowed are out of step with each other. So home builders sold, homeowners bought extra land, double lots, right? They were kind of sold on the side of this was desirable. And then there's this potential for redevelopment for more units than what was initially built as part of the first wave of development in the neighborhood. And so that coincides very much with Raleigh's population was probably about 200,000 then. We were seeing a lot of greenfield development, and we were starting to see some of the first infill and redevelopment in our inner neighborhoods. So there's kind of a handful that happen around that time. They happen off and on, and then there's a long drought. There's the one adopted in like 2006 or 2007, and then there's not another one for 10 years. Do you guys remember what happened in 2008? Right, and so residential development pressure really pancaked, flatlined, however you want to put it. And so neighborhoods weren't feeling that, they weren't seeing infill happen around them. And so there was not as much demand for these overlays. So the last one we had applied it was in 2019. And at the time of adoption, the council, our city council basically said, we're going to honor your request because you've been working, it had taken these folks about 2 years to get through the process because you've been working on this so diligently and so long. But Raleigh, we're not doing any more of these. Which we'll talk about more as the conversation goes on tonight. But so 2019 was our most recent one.
Awesome. So how in your communities, how do people, if they wanted to have one, how would they initiate it?
Ours is just pretty much just like yours. You
Yeah.
got to have 15 acres, 75% of the people have to agree. I don't think we have the age requirement. Corey, you said you do have.
Yeah, our size can be pretty small but then the lots have to be either created or built on at least 40 years ago. So it does kind of speak to this idea that there's historic character that's maybe not all the way to being a historic district.
Yeah. So for Raleigh, the neighbors have to bring a petition that represents 75% support for at least 15 acres. They come to council. And that first ask is, will you please tell staff to do a study about our neighborhood to help us quantify the built characteristics of our neighborhood? So that's how it starts. And then I'll just say a little bit more about how you keep going. Once that study's complete, then the neighborhood has to ask council again, will you please tell staff to work with us to develop a definition of a regulation for this neighborhood? And then they have to ask again to say, will you please ask staff to apply this regulation to our neighborhood? So there are a lot of opportunities for people to lose interest. But it really has to be, the neighborhood really has to be willing for it to work. Yep.
Yeah, it's a lot of process that's meant to build buy-in. So for us, for us, it's
That's a better way to put it. Opportunities to build buy-in in the community.
we want to make sure folks.
Nice
see
started
it.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Threshold is either representing 50% of the owners or 50% of the land ownership, I guess. But it is a similar multi-step process. They petition council to say, like, do you agree we qualify? And then you have to do some community outreach meetings and then come back to council. Can you petition us to develop have staff analyze and develop the standards? And then bringing in folks from the neighborhood to work on a conservation plan. And when that's done, then you go into the formal rezoning process where council comes in again to apply it.
So I'm going to go slightly off script. Do you guys have any other tools in your toolbox to accomplish anything similar that's not as long and arduous as the process you just described?
I mean, we have historic districts. It's just kind of parallel to what you all have. That's about it.
So we have the historic district, the general historic district, which covers the entirety of the lot. We have the street side tool, which we only have one of those, but I actually think that it's very underutilized. It's really a kind of a sweet spot in terms of historic preservation and sort of balancing free will of property owner with, I also want to contribute to the fabric of my neighborhood. And then we do have infill development standards that apply sometimes depending on how uniform development is in the area and how extensive development is. So if there are a lot of gaps in the fabric, they don't kick in. And if there are really disparate development types and there's not like it doesn't really hang together, those standards don't typically apply.
But they just automatically kick in otherwise.
Yeah.
Interesting. So how important do you guys think community support and engagement is? You know, you've described a long, arduous, two sides of the coin, buy and lose interest process. How important do you think that community engagement and support is throughout kind of the process?
Yeah, I wouldn't even call it engagement. I would say it's sort of community will and participation. One of the first ones of these that I worked on after I came to work for the city, the leader was the lady who walked in the neighborhood. And she could not have done it if she was not the neighborhood walking lady. Everybody knew her. She knew everybody. And she had, her little coterie of other ladies that walked with her. They were an amazing community organizing machine because they were on the street all the time, And so then when they went door to door with asking for signatures and talking with people, I think they had so much social capital from being the ladies that walked in the neighborhood. I hope you can imagine like the visors and like the whole thing they really had, I would say, a huge advantage. And so the subsequent neighborhoods that we saw try to pursue this, the leaders did not have that visibility in the neighborhood, and I think that kind of slowed them down. They had to work a little harder to make the connections, like to get people to answer the door. So those ladies who walk, they have amazing, amazing social capital. It takes a lot of social capital to get your neighborhood around this.
Yeah, I would agree. It takes relationships enough that, it's going to be initiated by the neighborhood and you're going to have those petitions. And then the town's going to look to that neighborhood. I mean, it's a consultation, we have to bring you along with the zoning concepts so you can tell us what is right for your neighborhood, get those standards in the right place, build the agreement, as much as possible, consensus among all the neighbors before we bring it to council. So yeah, I mean, it really is all about engagement and community buy-in.
Yeah. I would add to that, so our regulations describe what's required from the petition as a majority. Our council will not vote on a simple majority. So if you have 51 of the 100 signatures, our council's not going to go along with that. So I said 75% because that's functionally typically what it takes, at least that, to get council to even do the character study.
Yeah, that's interesting. Why do you think, has anybody vocalized like why that is or what the principle is behind that?
I mean, I think that's a pretty rational attitude for an elected official. 51 is
Feels slim.
feels slim.
Yeah.
Yeah. 51 feels slim for an elected official. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, our process is also very council approval heavy, so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Because same thing, that is a lot of, I mean, it's politics, right? It's
It's very political.
yeah, it's very political. So have any of the districts, in your opinion, slowed development or changed development patterns based on the standards that have been in place? I mean, you both have a long history, right? So a good record. We're newbies.
I think yes, it's just hard to know the what if,
Yeah.
what would have happened in these neighborhoods without the neighborhood character restrictions. A little more context of our history with it. The first neighborhood that went for an NCD, it's called the North Side neighborhood. It's just north of downtown Chapel Hill, pretty close to campus. And in the 80s and 90s, they were seeing a lot of students moving into the neighborhood. So if when you're looking at this in the Chapel Hill lens, it is so much about where are students living and which neighborhoods perceive that students may infiltrate. I mean, and I mean, you do want people who live in a neighborhood who are responsible and who invest in there and to put in roots there. So you do have to recognize that, but also recognize that students need places to live. But so North Side, there was really a lot of pressure and change happening before the NCD tool was able to come into place. And so the neighborhood has continued to change. There's continued to be, I mean, it's not so much what you would call development, but just turnover in who lives there. and it historically is a Black neighborhood. And then a second neighborhood also close to downtown called Pine Knolls was one of the early neighborhood conservation districts, and it is similar demographic character. But those are like some of the neighborhoods closest to downtown. So it's like, well, what would have looked like by now without these tools? We can see over time like the pace of change, and particularly like you can look at the change in breakdown of proportion of home ownership versus rental. That's it's still moving towards rental, but it's slowing down. And then you have neighborhoods where I don't know that there was development pressure. I think it was sort of a reaction, just like preventative measure, that may have been close to campus or maybe a little further out, and were wealthier neighborhoods. And then there was a recent one, the most recent one in 2017. It's a little further from campus, but it's on one of the major roads in Chapel Hill. It's called Elkin Hills, and modest size homes in the neighborhood. And I think they understood that corridor was growing with like student apartments, and there were plans for the town to do more bus service. We're building a bus rapid transit project there in the next few years. And so I think they got kind of ahead of that curve and got NCD. And so, what could be interesting is once that bus rapid transit project is operating, what happens then might be the real test of how effective it is.
I would say probably the last half dozen districts in Raleigh have been very much focused on prohibiting subdivision because of that issue I talked about earlier, where the development pattern and what's allowed by right by the zoning are out of sync. So developed at a unit per acre, but the zoning allows maybe 2 or 4 units. And so you see folks, as property changes hands, oftentimes between generations, you see the land sells and then there's a new development. And that has really catalyzed a lot of our more recent districts. Some of our older overlays are actually related. I was talking to a couple of folks here before the meeting. So I was talking with Catherine back here, and she's talking to me about how the new houses in her neighborhood, it's a 1-for-1 replacement, but the new houses are really big. And the just how that relates to the scale of the historical development pattern feels just disconnected, right? And so some of our older districts did include height limits or more restrictive setbacks, so you get a smaller building footprint, a lower scale building. We are not, one of the things I think is really interesting about this being a community process is that the community has to come to an agreement about what regulations they are willing to subject themselves to. And as time has gone on, that list has gotten shorter in Raleigh. And so pretty much the only thing in the last 2 or 3 districts that anybody could agree on was minimum lot size. But if you look at the older districts, like they weren't willing to regulate parking surface area. They weren't, the new ones, they're not willing to regulate parking surface area. They don't want setbacks beyond maybe a front setback. And they are not willing to regulate building height beyond what the residential district allows by right. We do have some of that in the older district. And so your question, has it slowed development? I would say, I don't know that I think any of them have necessarily slowed development. Like the natural turnover and rebuild on lots has continued. What it has slowed is incremental increase of density in these neighborhoods in the city. And so I would say that has a change in development trend. Yeah.
How do you think, I know that y'all are not dissimilar from us in that, it's nice to be popular, but we have really big issues around displacement, gentrification, height of property values. You know, it's great when you want to sell your house. It's really bad when you want to buy a new house. When, you know, people can't afford their taxes, their property taxes. You have, you know, people who are maybe on fixed income and there's a lot of change there, or renters that can't afford their rent because the value of the house has gone up. So how do you think that issues like that is that I know y'all are probably grappling with those just like we are. How do you think that interplays with a character overlay or really any overlay? And does it help it, hurt it, no impact? Like how do you think that all works together?
So yeah, I mean, and we do have kind of a mixture in Chapel Hill. Some of the ones I've highlighted in the NCDs are those that were really driven more by worries about displacement and gentrification, North Side, Pine Knolls, Elkin Hills. And a few others could make that same argument. And then some that was never so much the worry. So it's like you kind of have to look at the different columns. And I mean, it's hard when a neighborhood becomes a desirable place to live to hold back the pressures. I think an NCD or an NCO can relieve some of the pressure, and then it could create opportunity just by kind of buying some time to fill in other resources. But when we were talking about like you mentioned property taxes, like what's the relief there? You know, if the neighborhood's desirable, the property value can continue to rise. You know, when houses are sold, those sale prices can continue to go up. So if you want to think about displacement and affordability, you certainly need to bring in other tools than just what zoning can do.
Something Charlotte, Raleigh, Chapel Hill all have in common is that we don't have enough housing for the people who want to live here. Things that we do as communities to limit the number of housing units in one part of the city, put pressure elsewhere in other parts of the city. And so I think there's a real community value question about, is the value of this neighborhood the way that it is now with no additional density, is that of a greater value or so great a value that it's worthwhile to put more pressure on some other neighborhood or some other place in the city? I just would ask you to think about that. That's a very political decision, right? Like that's not a staff decision. But I think the conservation overlay really calls the question of what's the value of this neighborhood the way that it is to our community today? Yeah. And is that value worth putting extra pressure on other parts, right? Should one part of the city have more pressure than another part? All things being equal, which we know all things are not equal, right? Like the closer you are to an institution of higher education or a healthcare institution or a government center with a ton of jobs or a research park with a ton of jobs, we always struggle with these things, right? Mm-hmm. You know, there's certain parts of our cities that are, because of their walkability or access to services or jobs or whatever, are experiencing more pressure than others. And so just thinking through, it's a little whack-a-mole, right? Like if you tamp down the pressure over here, what does it do elsewhere on the board?
And maybe sometimes that works. I mean, I see Charlotte has a lot of apartments going up. And when it's, you know, formal industrial areas, shopping centers, like those are a lot easier places to accept that they could turn into more housing. But if that's not how the rules are set up, or if it's hard to get the housing in those areas, then it's the pressure on the neighborhood. So at the same time, you may be trying to protect and conserve neighborhoods. Can the city promote and people kind of get on board with the larger volumes of housing in the places that are better able to absorb it?
I want to go back to something you said about what the intent is to maintain affordability. I don't think that the NCO is a viable tool by itself. It is not a silver bullet. Uh, it requires mixers to make a hot cocktail,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So, like just a straight up shot,
Mhm.
it's not going to do all the work.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's the tonic and you need a gin. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, sorry.
You know, we can do metaphors all the time. Got the tools in the toolbox.
I feel like Silver Tools are like so dry. Everybody understands
Yeah.
food and drink. But my point is, if you're trying to manage affordability, you have to combine that with some kind of property tax relief, right? Probably homeowner repair assistance, other things of that nature. For that to seem like that was the intent of the zoning regulation.
And I'll just put a plug in because you just said it, but if people are interested in anti-displacement work and all of the tools in the toolbox, mixers and the mixers for the drink, our Housing and Neighborhood Services team is hard at work on an anti-displacement strategy citywide. And there will be, it does include conversations like this, but it has a lot of that spectrum of things that you might need. And they'll be releasing all of those recommendations and quickly starting to implement many of them this fall. So we're happy to share information about how to stay engaged on that. But
Great.
because you brought it up, I want to take that opportunity to plug it if you're not engaged in that. So I just have a couple more questions because I want to make sure that the audience has ample time to ask questions. So do you have any things, like 3 things that you wish you could change about your ordinance if you could? And it doesn't have to be specific to neighborhood character. It could involve other overlays, historic districts too. But 3 things, 3 words of advice as Charlotte just embarking on this broader range that you wish had been incorporated in the ordinance that you guys work on.
I think just circle back to a few things I mentioned, you know, like Chapel Hill, we do a lot of our larger scale development through a tool called conditional zoning or something.
Oh yeah, we got that. We know all that. I mean, if you don't know about it, watch a third Monday meeting. in
Yeah.
Charlotte, yeah.
So you look at the zoning map for Chapel Hill and, you know, this site along a major road is zoned R1. That's a lower density residential district for us. And they're proposing to do mixed use and rezone it. And everyone's on board, you know, they think it works there. And then your neighborhood is zoned R1. And you're like, so that's on the table to do that kind of development. So I think the NCDs can be a reaction to underlying zoning, base zoning, not really saying enough about how vulnerable your neighborhood is to approving development. So, you know, I think if the zoning map can communicate that better and already have the zoning in place for that mixed use development, that can help. That does come with a trade-off because by doing the process going conditional zoning through council, there's opportunity to get into the details of what makes that development compatible with its surroundings, how you can realize more community benefits. But to some extent, you know, what's going on in the zoning map to begin with. I'm interested to hear about like this residential infill overlay that y'all have. Because something I was thinking about ahead of tonight is just, it is so much, you know, it is a process for the community to build that buy-in, for a neighborhood to work through establishing these standards. If there's something else that's a complementary tool for other neighborhoods that maybe can't organize that much or need to move quicker, having some other options that at least start to do the same kind of thing would be useful. Other thing I was thinking about, which I'm kind of spitballing here because like I don't know how you would start with this, but
That sounds dangerous.
I think a lot of what people care about in their neighborhoods is like older established neighborhoods is like mature tree canopy. And in Chapel Hill, I know this is true, we don't really we do anything to regulate trees in single family neighborhoods. It's sort of the spirit of like, well, you own this lot, you can do what you want with the trees on it. But in total, it's like,
It's a very North Carolina attitude.
It is
That
very-
is not
oh.
unique to Chapel
oh, no, well, yes. Yes, definitely in terms of spirit. I mean, we're here, the Piedmont, the whole state, Raleigh to Charlotte, we've got what we love about neighborhoods often is just kind of the landscape and the.
Oh, no, I meant that you can do whatever you want with the trees on your own land.
Okay, I got it.
That's a very North
Yes,
Carolina attitude.
that is a North Carolina
Yeah,
attitude.
yeah.
Yeah, so like, do you want to take that away? But like, in total, what are we doing to help neighborhoods still feel like they have that landscape character, which I think can be just as valued as the buildings and built character in the neighborhood.
I really want to lift that up because I think like 90% of what's wrong with new development is that the landscape is not yet mature. And so you have like this kind of stark, gangly new thing that's sprouted up out of the ground and its support network is not there yet, right? Like it's just a bald baby.
Yeah.
It needs hair. I'm trying to keep this light.
I agree.
Really dry. Try not to go there. The two things I would say about, I would love to see change about our particular ordinance for neighborhood conservation overlay. We require this built characteristics study. Oh my goodness, it is pretty rough. It involves people going out in the field with a laser to measure building height, which is precise but imprecise. And a lot of like field work to supplement desktop analysis. And then half the time at the end, the neighborhood doesn't care about building height. And so I really struggle with, we have to go out and measure all the things per code. And I feel like that's a huge waste of your tax dollars, that our code works that way. And then the other thing I would say is our code does not have a really clear mechanism or any sort of articulation of considerations for when the boundary of the overlay might change or when the overlay how the overlay might be removed altogether. We definitely have some places that have overlays that nobody's interested in them anymore. And so we're going through this process of individual rezonings for the overlay to go away. And like nobody's crying over that. The neighborhood has sort of moved on from that moment. And yet there's a lot of hand wringing. It's like, oh, well, as a community, we put this in place. Must it last forever? And sort of a feeling that zoning is forever, which if zoning were forever, I would not have a job. Because we wouldn't rezone stuff. But I think having some clarity in your code and even considerations, like in our code, oftentimes there'll be something like considerations for the planning director in the event of a request, right? And so I think having that criteria of, well, how do you know when it's okay to take a lot out? How do you know when it's okay to take the overlay away? Or even how do you evaluate that? What's some criteria to evaluate that?
Yeah, that's really great advice and reflective of, I think, some of the conversations we've been having too as we embark on this is what does all that mean? So I'm going to open it up to you guys for questions now. And Christy, well, yeah.
Microphones behind you.
Oh, and if you want to just kind of
Who has a question?
raise.
Raise your hand.
That
Anybody?
might just be, nobody has a question?
Nobody has questions? Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
My question is this, in our neighborhood, as everybody's neighborhood is going, we have, I guess the gentrification, and this is new to me, so if my language is awkward, that's what it is. But my question is, we had new houses that were built in our neighborhood, and as you were talking, I was thinking about the spacing between the housing. It's totally different with the new housing that's coming into our neighborhood. I mean, our neighborhood is a very established neighborhood, and the houses aren't real close to each other. Established ones aren't, but it seems like the ones that are coming in now, they don't have that framework. establishing a distance between those two housing. Is that something that this overlay thing could address or? And it's not that we have a lot of new housing or new development in our neighborhood. It's just the ones that are there. And I was just thinking in terms of ones that may come, like if somebody would sell a lot and instead of having one house there, they have two and they're real close together.
Yeah, I mean, I can.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is one of the 6 things that in a character overlay can be managed. I mean, it's either through setbacks, which is basically how far a building sits from a property line, or lot size, like how big the actual lot is. Some of the residential infill overlay standards, there's 3 standards basically, and that helps you deal with the scale, how big the scale is, just by looking at what is existing there and where the building sits on the lot. So that can also have some effect on how big those are. But the bottom line is, and Bynum did a good job of describing this, is that the number of houses allowed and how big the lots are currently are just not matched. So if I'm a builder, I can just go in and build what we call by right, meaning I can just do it. If I go and get a permit, I can just go and build houses that are the way that you're seeing them built, so I can take one lot and make it 2, if the size works out with what the law ordinance is.
Well, I have a question about lot size. This may be part of the overlay.
Yeah, you press the button. Yeah, there you go. You're good.
Well, my question is that, what I was thinking was that in the construction area for your homes, the house, if not for the overlay, there is a code that the house can be, but so close, I mean, there had to be a certain distance apart. Is that the case? I mean, in the city of Charlotte, you just can't put a house a foot from the other house. There is a code that, if I'm not mistaken, that dictates that distance between 2 homes.
That's true. But the standards, it all depends on what the district is that you are in. So that amount is different based on the district that you're in.
Okay, so that amount, what you're saying would, I mean, didn't turn green. That amount you're saying, let's say in Northeast Charlotte, the distance may be 7 feet, let's say. And say I go out there in Southeast Charlotte, the distance may be 5 feet. Is that what you're saying?
If the district underneath it is different, then that amount.
The zoning.
The zoning. So meaning, when we say the district, we mean the zoning district.
Okay.
So meaning, now we're using neighborhood 1, neighborhood N1, N1A, N1B, N1C. So there are different, what we call setbacks, which is how far the building is from the property line. There are different measurements. Depending on what that actual underlying zoning district. Like I live in a neighborhood that was what they called R5, meaning you could build 5 houses per acre. In the new zoning ordinance, I think that's N1B. So meaning now N1B is close to 5 units per acre, but that tells you, 10 feet from the property line, you can have a building. 20 feet from the street is where your front porch can start. So standards like that. And that's pretty universal in zoning codes across the country, or standards like that. Everybody's is a little different.
And if you need help finding that for your specific neighborhood, talk to one of us. We'll show you how to figure that out and where to go. We're glad to help.
My question is, how are we defining a neighborhood? Because where I live, we were trying to combine communities and kind of make it one big neighborhood. But I guess that's not the way it works. So my question is trying to understand, how did you define what a neighborhood is, so that you could say that this this area is ruled by this overlay?
I think in a lot of cases, you can look at the history of when homes in that area were built. But just because that's often the case doesn't mean that's the only way you define a neighborhood. If you find a place that really started to grow organically instead of kind of someone who owned the land and created all the lots, then I think it's interesting to think about how places, blocks in proximity could come together and feel like they have an identity today together. But I guess it would kind of depend on how the tool's set up to think about situations like that. Yeah.
Well, we don't have to add on, like, a neighborhood as defined by using an overlay district is not, it's not like all of Villa Heights is in a character overlay. It's written into the ordinance, so it's like 15 acres. They have to be contiguous, meaning connected, but it's not like this entire neighborhood must participate based on what our kind of known boundaries are. And if a neighborhood was adjacent to another neighborhood and they had and it's based on the similarity of characteristics. So if a neighborhood was adjacent to another neighborhood and let's say they're all 1960s brick ranch houses that are similar in quality, they could be in the same district per se and have the same standards because they share all the same qualities, so it's really more about what's built than what we associate as our neighborhood boundaries, just by living there and kind of knowing this is where the neighborhood changes from this to this.
Right, and the shared characteristics is key. Like a neighborhood or houses that were built in like the 1960s have a very different development pattern than the houses built in like late 1990s. So it would be hard to combine those two neighborhoods. Yep.
I have a question piggybacking on what you just said, because our neighborhood now, we have established neighborhoods, established homes that have been there for a long time. And then we have these other homes that are coming, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, they're new homes or whatever, but how do you govern? I guess govern is not. How do you, I'm gonna use govern. How do you govern where there's a cutoff? You know what I mean? Where you have like these old you have these old houses, then you have these new houses that are coming.
Twice as big.
Right. When do you cut that off? I mean, is it possible to cut off?
It's part of the planning process for neighborhood character. The first thing we look at is what are the boundaries and what boundaries meet all the qualifications that Monica outlined, the 15 acres, 25 years or older, 75% developed, and then we look at that. And then next we look at what are the shared characteristics of this neighborhood, and where does it start? Where do the lines start getting blurred where it's no longer the older neighborhood, but now it's all new development? And that is part of the planning process that us as city staff will help with. Is there anything else to add to that?
No, I think that's good.
Okay.
I would like to just add just a little bit of perspective here. So the oldest historic district in Raleigh, the biggest historic district in Raleigh, has a period of significance that's about 120 years long. And, development there started in the early 1800s, and the National Register recognizes structures in that neighborhood built anytime between 1800 to 1920 as contributing to the character of that neighborhood. And so I just want to say the questions you're asking, the experiences you're having are not new to city life. This has been happening as long as people have been living in community. I came here and I built my thing. Then you came next door and you built your thing and it was different, right? And with, 200 years hindsight, we come to value the jumble that represents and the mix and the diversity and that character. But initially, that introduction disrupts the homogeneity of design and is disconcerting and found alarming. So I just wanted to offer that as a little bit of perspective. I'm sure that the oldest historic district which represents probably the oldest neighborhood in Charlotte, is the same way. Or pretty close.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to throw that out there, right? That neighborhoods have never been totally static.
Right,
Yeah.
right. We had a gentleman over here.
Hey, thanks, guys. So a couple questions, just real quick on the characteristics. You said the various characteristics, 25 years, 75% developed. And they were talking about percentage buy-in. Do we have a percentage buy-in in Mecklenburg or Charlotte rather?
Yeah, do you remember that? Yeah.
Yes, we do. So to get started, the percentage is just to get started, 25% or 25% of the land area. But to get it to city council, it's a minimum 51% buy-in. That's minimum. Every time, we talk about a new district, our encouragement as staff is to get as much buy-in as possible.
Right.
Because, council will look more favorably if it has more neighborhood support. And then we also, recommend coming out in force to the council public hearings and the zoning committee and everything through the rezoning process. But the more support, the better. The minimum is 51%.
I mean, the boundary, to be clear, if you get 75% of it, there's still 25% of people who live within that are impacted, right, by that overlay or that decision. And so obviously more is better because the more people who understand what that impact is and agree to it, eyes wide open, and that's what the impact is, the better.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so on the infill overlays, we're talking about all the houses are, let's just say, 100 feet back from the road. And there's some space in between some houses. In the absence of an infill overlay, I could build closer than 100 feet or further than 100 feet. Right? So whatever the by right is right now,
But yeah,
institute the overlay, the infill overlay, then it would be restricted.
Correct.
Okay.
A lot of times in some of the older neighborhoods, like Monica gave the example of like ranch style neighborhoods, the setbacks are deeper than what the underlying zoning allows. So a lot of those are 50, 60 foot setbacks, and underlying zoning, I believe in N1 is like 20 feet from the front property line.
and the reverse of that is like in mill district neighborhoods, it's less. So it is really like what exists, you're looking at, there, it can be opposite, right?
And it would look silly, and that's why we're having a conversation about overlays, because that would look silly.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can honestly drive in neighborhoods and see new construction houses and see, there's 5 houses down from me that I'm like, oh, well, you can tell what the setback is because it's an extra 12 feet behind where every other house on the street is. And maybe that adds character. People have differing opinions of, do you like that? Do you not like that? But it is what it is. It's a product of the regulation under which it was built,
I will, to confuse the issue a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah.
We do have an alternative setback requirement. So for anything that requires a deeper setback, what could have happened on that street is they could have asked for an alternative setback to match the setback on the street, and they could have pulled the house closer. But we only have that when the setback is deeper than what is established. We don't have it for the opposite, where the established setback is deeper and what's allowed is closer. So that's where these overlays come in. Another question, does it lead to a follow-up question?
Just, I think for people that didn't really pick up on that, what you're saying is if all houses are 100 feet back and the new house is 20 feet back, there's not going to be pressure to set that house back 100 feet. But if all the houses are 20 feet and the rule is 30 feet, then there can be permission granted to come up.
To go forward, yeah. Yep.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
It's not required.
It's not required.
You
So,
can go through a process to.
and people often, like
Don't.
Monica pointed out, they don't do it.
I want to go back to the trees, what you guys brought up earlier. So in Charlotte, the historic district overlay that we already have has extensive rules on how trees can be protected. We don't have street side yet, but in theory, it will protect trees. But city staff last week, or 2 weeks ago when we had our meeting, they don't yet have precedent or understanding on how backyard trees would be addressed, because you could still see those from the street. And also in this new neighborhood character overlay, they have a ability to make rules about trees, but that hasn't been done yet. So we don't really know what that means yet because we don't have precedents. It hasn't gone through yet. So I wanted to find out how in both street side and neighborhood character overlay, you guys address trees, if anything.
I don't know that off the top of my head about the street side district. Typically, the regulation there is like the front half of the lot. But then I do think it extends anything visible from the street. So I don't know.
Was our philosophical question when I talked to Chad last week ago.
I'd have to
Yeah.
go back and look at the way the code is written. I can certainly follow up with Christy. We can talk with Colette and Tanya,
That would be great.
figure that part out. And then we don't regulate any vegetation in our neighborhood conservation district and generally don't regulate much tree or other vegetation on residential lots in general. And a lot of the explanation that I have heard for that is that we don't have a lot of enabling authority from the state legislature to regulate trees.
Like, I don't know.
Maybe you have fresher information than I do. That'd be groovy.
Or maybe we just interpret things differently. Yeah, we just interpret things differently.
I think.
Yeah, we have.
Every city attorney is different.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And I wish Tim was here to speak to it, but we actually are embarking as part of the UDO. There is a whole new host of regulations around trees in Charlotte, including on single family lots. And I don't know if you know, I don't know the specifics.
I know the specifics.
Do you know the
Yes.
specifics? Okay.
So it's the heritage tree program, and heritage trees are anything 30 inches in diameter or larger, and they also have to be a native species. So things like a deodar cedar, which while those can be huge and are kind of special for this area, they're not native to North Carolina, so they wouldn't fall into the heritage tree category. And that's what they're starting to look at. So anything 30 inches and over has to go through our urban forestry program for approval to remove. And then there's either a replacement requirement, or you could also pay a fee equivalent to the number of trees you're taking down and how big it is.
And
yes. And that
has nothing to do with the overlay district.
No.
That's for
Everywhere.
every residential property. So whether you're in an overlay, a historic district, it goes everywhere basically.
for Charlotte.
It's for all of Charlotte. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. We have tree save in every development. And then this is the first, like I'm a homeowner on my property. I'm not a developer. I just want to take down a tree. You're going to have to get a permit if it falls into that category. So maybe your lawyers can speak to our lawyers if they have questions. Yeah. 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 They're saying, yeah, we've got it, right? Oh. See, well, maybe you guys can get it too.
Any other questions? Yeah, here you go. Okay.
It's just a real general question about the neighborhood districts, like the N1A, B, C. Does it have any correlation to density? Like you said, yours was a B, it was more like R5. So just from looking at it big picture, like if I'm a C, how does that?
Yeah, the higher the letter, the more. So we moved away from density as a straight conversion, and it's about lot size, setbacks, things of that nature. So it in effect impacts density because it's how many lots that size you can fit onto a piece of property.
Okay.
And so the higher the letter A, B, C, D, the smaller the lot, theoretically, the more buildings can go on an acre, or the more houses can go on an acre. So if I was like an N1C or an N1D, the lots are smaller, basically.
Okay.
And the setbacks are smaller and things of that nature. So that is, if others want to add to that, that's basically how it works. And there's N2, which is multifamily, and it's kind of the same principle, right? And into A, into B, you're getting more units, more taller buildings, less setback, the higher the letter goes.
And Monica, I'll just add charlotteudo.org has a lot of resources.
Yeah.
So if you have questions, there are multiple resources there that explains things pretty well. Absolutely.
In Raleigh, why did your council say in 2019 they didn't want any more overlay districts?
So the council member that said that acknowledged that a lot of the NCODs in Raleigh currently replicate deed restrictions and defunct homeowners association covenants, that while the NCOD doesn't actually include the language, recognizes there was a lot of racist language in some of those historic documents, and that the intent of the lot size limit or lot size minimums and other development restrictions paired with those very racist statements, very much the spirit of that was exclusion and keeping people out, keeping people who looked a certain way out of neighborhoods. I actually brought with me, this is the most egregious piece of language I have read on this topic. This is a neighborhood east of downtown Raleigh that was developed by white developers for white families and transitioned to be predominantly African-American, and now it's pretty mixed. But this language, so it's called Section 12, exclusive white occupancy, etc. That's the name of the section. And it says, with the utmost respect and goodwill for all groups of people, but realizing that a high degree of homogeneity is necessary for that actively congenial community life desired for Longview Gardens. No land in Longview Gardens shall ever be sold, transferred, conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to, or occupied, servants accepted, by any person who is not wholly Caucasian. And in those blocks in Longview Gardens designated by letters of the alphabet on the recorded maps, no land shall be sold, transferred, mortgaged, devised, leased to, or occupied by any person who is not predominantly descendant of those native, North European, national, and racial stocks who comprise the bulk of North Carolina's white population: English, Scotch, Welsh, Irish, French, German, Dutch, Swiss, Belgian, Scandinavian. I mean, like the intent there is very clear, right? And so when you pair that with other lot regulations, building regulations, it seems very clear that the intent was to keep people out. And the council person didn't think we should keep doing that, that the city's regulations should not perpetuate that, as best we could avoid it.
I would just throw in, since you mentioned restrictive covenants, what is the relationship here? And I think that does get tricky because neighborhoods have restrictive covenants today that are not that. But that have that kind of association in many cases when it's an older neighborhood where, you peel away some things that are no longer legal, but it's still like, what is this neighborhood doing to be exclusive? I think Chapel Hill's had a similar experience where people use the NCD tool in different contexts and in enough cases of that kind of situation where you're just like, well, is this accomplishing what we originally intended? So I think for Charlotte, being new to this program and knowing that history, there's opportunity to think about the best that something like an NCO can be. But like we had one of the later NCDs that got adopted in 2015. The reasoning for doing it, like they just put up a chart and said, well, the neighborhood has these restrictive covenants, and it was all about lot dimensions and the kind of stuff we're looking at here. And they just said, well, and they would like to have an NCD that mirrors those restrictive covenants. It's like, okay, that's fine, but we need to spend our town resources on that when the restrictive covenants already do the same thing. So, when you get into that conversation, I think it's just.
Right, when the neighborhood comes and says, but my HOA has fallen into disorganization, municipal organization, can you do this for my neighborhood?
Yeah.
but not for other neighborhoods. Can you treat me differently than other neighborhoods?
Yeah, that's not what we're trying to be here doing.
Yeah.
But we want to help those neighborhoods that are, yeah.
And real quick, if we can move on deeper, I did just want to comment on some of those really quick that, so we have in our ordinance, the planning director has the ability to help us prioritize basically how we handle applications for overlay districts. And it is a strong priority of our department to prioritize not only considering the age of a neighborhood, but also its location, the vulnerability to displacement. Is it in an area of influence of our corridors of opportunity, which are historically underinvested corridors that are our majority African-American, Latino corridors, huge international population in some of them. And so it is a priority as we embark on this and really understand what it means, not to exclude other neighborhoods that want to use the tool, but to really prioritize staff resources for communities and neighborhoods that kind of hit the mark in those areas, right? And so that we are kind of looking at it with an equity lens and taking into account how can we make sure that we are looking at it in a fair light, given the amount of staff resources that we have, and that it is a labor-intensive process, and we have to be judicious with staff and how we handle the requests, knowing that people are excited. They want to use the tool. And so, yeah, so we're happy to share more about all that criteria if you're specifically interested to.
We also had specific discussions about this is not to take the place of easements or covenants or HOAs. Like that is, if that exists, then use your tool. Like this is to be prioritized in other places.
But we're also newbies, so I feel like
Yes, thank you.
We'll get the same request and learn our same lesson. So I know you, sir, I'm sorry, Aaron, did you want to add after?
Oh, thank you. No problem. That was one of my questions actually, was whether or not decision-making hierarchy had been put in place for more vulnerable communities, because I thought I had heard that. And I would suggest that folks who, certain populations who perhaps look like me are in a much better place many times to defend our living situation than, say, folks who find themselves with a certain set of realities in a built community, which is a byproduct of decisions that folks made who look like me, right? So good news to hear that that's where the money will go first from a staffing perspective. And that leads to my actual question, forgive the preaching there. What does the staffing look like on this? Because I'm in a neighborhood that's working on a historic district overlay, and there's a real push from camps in our neighborhood to consider neighborhood character overlay, which is, all good. So we are currently in disagreement on that. I'd like to understand, the process for the historic district overlay is long since established, a very seasoned process. Where are we with the neighborhood character overlay process, staffing it, who does what, when? I've been prone to saying in meetings like this one, where I'm talking with some of my neighbors about these things, that process is not yet mature, and there are parts of it that aren't even properly birthed. But I don't want to be misrepresenting that.
So you're looking at it, basically, that's the short answer, is you're looking at the staff resources in this room right here, and they're sprinkled throughout. It's not you're looking at it like me, it's you're looking at it. Yeah, everyone raise your hand that works on this.
Is it historic district overlay? Is it historic district staff that's going to take all of this?
So it'll be a combined effort between urban design center staff and historic district staff. There are the character study and characteristics. Our urban design team, that is their focus, is built environment and how buildings sit on lots and understanding that. So it will be a joint effort, because our preservation staff obviously has a very regimented schedule with historic districts that they have to follow and stick with. So it'll be a team effort on it. We also will have consultant support that is already in place and ready to go. Because of the interest, we feel very lucky that we were able to do that and have it in place prior to the ordinance going into effect. So you will see other faces besides just ours if you are going through the process. The first step in the process is to set up a meeting and an application. Do you want to?
Application.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can share. Do you want to share?
Yeah, we can share it.
Well, you want to, let's share it at the end?
Yeah, we'll
Okay,
share it
go
at the
ahead.
end.
Yeah. But application is online, and the first step is to fill out that application and have a pre-submittal meeting with us and staff. And that's where we were talking about, we look at the map, we look at the boundaries, we look at what your neighborhood goals are. We ask you what of these characteristics you're looking to maintain in your neighborhood, and we have that conversation. That's the first step.
Yeah, and that's not, you're not locking it in stone at that point in time. That's just an informational meeting for you to understand the process and to start understanding the effort on the community side. And that meeting you can have for any of the overlay districts. So if you're interested in the residential infill overlay, you're interested in the neighborhood character overlay, you're interested in historic district street side, you can go into that meeting and even come out of it and say, ooh, I think we might do this instead of this. You know, you can, it's really an informational meeting. We are having those right now. So you can schedule that right now. This fall, we'll be kicking off the first set of people going through the process with the character studies. So if you are, we're working on the date of kind of what's going to be our hard deadline, but we will set a date, likely late October, early November. We'll make sure that's readily available. And basically that will kick off a group together so that we can kind of go through the process and not have people at different points in time. And then after that, I think it will be a little bit more fluid, kind of similar to what you guys described, where it's, you know, one neighborhood comes together and does it. But just for this initial batch, we're trying to be conscientious about resources and effort and what that takes and do it more in a
program.
Yeah,
Really.
pilot kind of, this is the pilot group and we're going to do it together, basically.
I want to follow that question. It occurs to me that all the talk here is on about the front end of the process, all right? So I understand the historic district process that we've got in place, and it works. Once you've established the district, it works because the property owner in the district has to apply for permission to make a change.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it's enforced. So with the overlay districts, how are they enforced? Do you work through the building standards?
Yes.
And zoning enforcement?
Yes.
How in the world are you training those poor folks?
So that is why it's a very set list, and it is all quantitative on the list. And I don't know if you guys want to speak to that at all, how it happens in Raleigh and Chapel Hill, but it is it's a checklist.
I would like to hear them speak to that, because if you have to rely upon somebody complaining about a violation rather than the front end permit process that's used in historic district, that's a real problem.
No, it's on the front end. It's on the front.
You have permission?
When you apply for your building permit,
Okay.
they're reviewing your plans to make sure you meet whatever design standards like setback height. If those are your two that you've picked for your neighborhood character, and say you've decided our setback needs to be 50 feet. If the new construction comes in and it's not 50 feet, they'll reject it. So it's all caught at the permit review.
Every time you establish a new conservation overlay district, you sit down with building standards, zoning enforcement, and you do a training session.
It will be on the map, similar to historic districts, like we have neighborhood 1-HDO. This will be the same thing, neighborhood 1-NCO. And so the permit reviewers will know that it will be tied to the parcel.
Yeah. Or RIO.
Or RIO, yep.
Did you guys want to speak?
Well, I was just going to say, it is all through the administrative process. And so your question about like training and how different is it? It's really not that different, because I see you give me the smile. I see your skeptical smile, but it's the same types of regulations that apply to every residential lot. And so how to apply the regulation is not particularly complex. It's just recognizing that there's a distinct one there above and beyond the base district. And because it's applied via zoning, they're all already trained to already look at all the zoning overlays, to look at the base zoning, because those are the rules they use to evaluate whatever's submitted. So I would say that I actually think the NCO, because it's administrative and incorporated into site plan review, is less cumbersome to staff than the COA process, which is a quasi judicial review of major work, right?
Right.
Yeah, of the historic district, yeah.
So, I mean, we start off when you get a permit application, checking the map, what zoning is in place, what overlays are in place, and planners are very good with maps, generally speaking. So they'll recognize, okay, there's this special set of standards in place. Let me look those up. Let me see how they supersede other standards beyond what's in the NCO. But yeah, I mean, that's the work we do.
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Of course.
Okay, cool. I live here too.
It says Erin Sponcher, who is our Urban Design Center Manager.
My neighborhood is considering a neighborhood character overlay. For most people, right, the house that they own is the only investment they have, regardless of threat to displacement or race or anything else. And use it to for lots of things, the value of their home. Have you heard opposition in your communities against the neighborhood character overlays for taking away development rights of their parcel and value of their property? And do you think that's true or not? And if it's true, what is your response to people who say those things?
I think there are definitely people who think it limits their rights, because it does. It limits the flexibility of what can happen on a lot. There's really no, that's the intent.
I mean, the value of their property.
Yeah.
The potential of the value.
Yeah, I think it's debatable what it does to property values. So if you limit supply, it's going to drive cost up over time. But the immediate value of being able, I have one lot now and I could have two. There's a lot of value to me in that as a current owner, right? In terms of, I have this investment, I would like to take my money out of my investment and go do something else. The immediate return, I think, with more flexibility, there's more money in play, but I think in the long run, it drives the price up. But can you afford to hold that long? I might not live that long. I mean, I'm not that old, but if I have to wait another 30 years, I'm not going to enjoy that money much. So those are just some things to think about.
Have you done any studies?
We have not, I don't think we have done any directed at that particularly. We definitely have information about how housing costs have changed in different parts of the city over time. I could go back and look at that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, let's be honest, property values in Raleigh have, like, population doubled since I finished high school. The property values have kind of quadrupled. So
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
does it, in a high growth area, can you really point at any zoning tool?
Yeah, if you just want to make sure your home is able to maintain itself as a source of wealth, I don't know that limitations on, how much of your lot you can build on in a place with high demand for housing, I think the property values are going to be preserved. If you're really thinking about, like, I guess I'm thinking investment as the word. Like, if you're thinking, like, let me maximize what I can get out of the lot, that's going to be difficult to accept if your neighbors want the NCO. I think in our experience, I think people, it's a trade-off, and people recognize the value of their homes is not just how big it can be, but like what the quality of the neighborhood, and so you factor that in. We did have, like, situations where neighborhoods would say that you can't have an accessory dwelling under our overlays because we allow those broadly in most neighborhoods in Chapel Hill. So if you want to have an apartment over your garage or a backyard cottage, we would normally allow that. But an NCD might have said like, no, we don't want that because someone might build it and rent it to students. But then someone else comes along a few years later and says like, well, it would help me stay in this property if I could rent out something else for extra income. So maybe at that level, you just want to think about the longevity of you and your home over time and what your needs are.
And to be clear too, that this tool, no matter which tool you used it cannot change like a lot of people here are really nervous about duplexes and triplexes because they're allowed on every in one lot. And this might make it harder per se because of the scale, but it cannot take it off the table basically because it's not one of the things you can regulate. So really no matter what your NCOD or your residential infill overlay, or RIO as we like to call it, or your RIO, they're still allowed, right? They're still allowed. They just might look and feel closer to what's around them than if there was nothing there, basically. And same ADUs too, same thing. Accessory dwelling units, like the apartment or the garage. We're getting close to time. So if you have another question, great, we'll take maybe one or two more.
I know with a historic district ordinance or overlay rather, that approval is required for certain things. And some of those things require more of the whole council, not just the whole committee, not just the office staff. How does that compare with the NCOs?
So as we were mentioning, the NCOs, everything is done administratively, meaning that it happens when like I did an addition to my home. When I went to go pull the permits for the addition, the staff at that point in time, just like you would do to get building permits, would check that you're meeting the standards. So it's not a process where you go through an extra board or you go through any other kind of staff review other than that. When you submit for that building permit, they do a zoning check, which includes all the setbacks and all those things. So it's just like building, an addition to your home in any neighborhood, basically, or a new house in any neighborhood. Same.
And I know the HDO has been established a long time and the procedure is well defined and a timeline has some parameters. But with an NCO, do we have any insight as to what those things could be or might be?
I mean, I'm assuming it's fairly quick. Do you mean timeline for approval?
Yeah, the process, the timeline to complete the whole process.
Oh, to get an NCO.
Saying 8 to 12 months is our guess. And we will know more after we run our pilot program. But some of it requires it'll depend on the community, right? So to submit for the rezoning, you have to have that minimum 51% buy-in, and that might take some time to get that or more. So there's some variables that it's hard to exactly pin down. We know the rezoning process takes approximately 4 months, but there are some moving parts.
But you start the rezoning process once you have that petition signed. So it's 4 months from that. And to be clear, which I think everybody understands, is that that's a community driven to get the petition signed and to get the all of that signed is community led. Staff really, we can't be involved in that. So we're happy to answer your questions, but we can't assist because that's not really our job to advocate for a district. It's really our job to process it and to follow the ordinance.
We'll pull the property owner information for you. We'll give you that. We'll give you the petition template.
Like we'll get all that.
But you got to get the signatures.
You provide the tools.
You go to the door to door. Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say in Raleigh, so there's the first ask of council, which is the study, and then the second ask is for them to create the regulations. And getting to agreement for neighbors on what regulations they want the council to enact is, I would say the slowest part.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because people have to like be willing to have that, willing to consider in the next step in rezoning that they would be willing to have that put on their property. And so you have neighbors sort of trying to game that and figure out, which is what I was talking about, like people don't want to regulate how much parking area they can have on their lot, or they don't want to, they don't want additional limits on building height or setback or whatever it is. And so that kind of coming to some sort of consensus or like the kumbaya moment of this is what we are all willing to, this is what we're asking for because we want to apply this to ourselves later. That I would say is the toughest part. But because that is considered a text change to our Unified Development Ordinance, there is some staff facilitation of the process. They're not really advocating for any particular outcome, but they do help organize the meetings and create the venue for public discussion about the things.
And
yours is very.
That's what we're,
Yours is
we're
like-
planning on doing,
Yeah.
that similar kind of facilitation and.
We're not going to knock on doors and ask people to sign
Yeah,
a petition.
Yeah.
Any
let's-
last questions? One more?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for
guys
coming.
For being here. And thank our panelists for traveling.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. See, Raleigh and Charlotte, we can get along. We can all work together to grow. Yeah.